We've talked about the Earth's radiation budget and how greenhouse gases work in the Earth's atmosphere. Now let's take a look at the carbon cycle, as carbon dioxide is the major greenhouse gas that we have to worry about going forward over the next several centuries. If we think about the carbon cycle, usually we think about trees and soils, things very close to the Earth's surface and the land that we live on. In fact, the carbon cycle is a lot more complicated and a lot more vast than we normally think about. If you take the size of the entire terrestrial biosphere, all of the animals and all of the plants on the surface of the Earth, it's only about 600 or 700 billion tons of carbon. We keep track of the amounts of carbon in these reservoirs in terms of billions of tons of carbon, not as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the reason for that is that the carbon will stay, that mass of carbon is conservative, whether it becomes organic carbon in wood, or whether it turns into carbon dioxide in the air, or it dissolves as bicarbonate in the ocean, the mass of carbon is the same. And so we like to keep track of carbon as the mass of carbon. You could also do it in terms of moles, which would be a little more of a chemically correct way of doing it. But for simplicity, the convention is always to think about it in terms of billions of tons of carbon, or gigatons of carbon. If we think at the whole terrestrial biosphere, that's equivalent or very close to the amount of carbon that was in the pre-industrial atmosphere. So even though the terrestrial biosphere seems vast, and most of that mass is in wood and trees, it's actually relatively small compared to other parts of the carbon cycle. Soils, for example, have a much larger amount of carbon. We don't know exactly. The reason for that is that exactly what's a soil and what's a sediment, what's a geological rock versus a soil is a somewhat arbitrary definition. But we think that there's something like 2,000 to 3,000 gigatons of carbon in soils, so several times the amount that's in the active terrestrial biosphere. But if we look at the ocean, the numbers get much, much bigger. Most carbon dissolved in seawater is as bicarbonate, HCO3-, and the total amount is around 40,000 billion tons. Enormous compared to the 600 or 700 gigatons in the pre-industrial atmosphere, and about the same in the terrestrial biosphere. There's also a fair amount of dissolved organic carbon in seawater. This is the result of essentially phytoplankton and zooplankton, the organic material from algae and bacteria and all of the other living organisms and dead remnants of those living organisms in the ocean. And this, all in all, amounts to about another 1,000 gigatons. So even, again, larger than the whole terrestrial biosphere. What's interesting about the carbon cycle is that these different reservoirs exchange at different rates. So, for example, the terrestrial biosphere takes up carbon by photosynthesis. Trees, plants photosynthesize and turn carbon dioxide in the air into organic carbon in their roots, in their trunks, in their leaves. The total amount of photosynthesis is around 100 gigatons of carbon per year. And it's almost perfectly balanced each year by the amount of respiration. Now, that doesn't all happen by the plants themselves. About half of that actually comes from soils. So trees, at least deciduous trees, drop their leaves in the fall, and by the spring and summer, most of that tree material, that old branches and leaves, have been decomposed by bacteria, by fungi, back into carbon dioxide and released back to the atmosphere. So there's a continuous cycle of photosynthesis and respiration that are near balance. In the ocean, there's a similar cycle. So there's exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean. And most of it is actually not driven by photosynthesis of algae, but actually driven by air-sea gas exchange. So carbon dioxide in the air is constantly exchanging with bicarbonate in seawater, and as the surface ocean tries to re-equilibrate with the atmospheric composition of carbon dioxide. Overall, that amount is also about 100 billion tons of carbon per year, but in fact, it's actually a relatively small amount compared to the size of the entire ocean carbon reservoir, which is about 40,000 billion tons. So in that case, the timescale for air-sea gas exchange to equilibrate the entire ocean is actually very, very long. It's a lot longer than we think. And in fact, it's even longer than you would get just from that exchange rate because of ocean circulation. It turns out that the surface of the ocean, the shallow part of the ocean, the upper 100 meters or so, we call it the mixed layer because it's mixed rapidly by the winds and by tides. That mixed layer has only about 1,000 billion tons of carbon. And so the air-sea gas exchange at 100 billion tons of carbon per year equilibrates the surface ocean with the atmosphere on a timescale of about 10 years. But the much slower process is the mixing of that shallow water into the deep ocean. And the entire ocean mixing takes more like 1 to 2,000 years. It's a much longer, slower process. And so the timescale for the whole ocean to mix and equilibrate with the atmosphere is actually very long, is millennia. So if you think about all of these reservoirs that are exchanging on different timescales, there's of course also the fossil fuel reservoir. Now, the fossil fuel reservoir is just, you can think of it as a small piece of the much larger organic carbon reservoir in sediments. In the case of coal deposits, these were terrestrial wetlands mostly, that were peat deposits that ultimately were buried in the earth, heated and pressurized, and turned into modern coal deposits. In the case of oil and gas, this was mostly marine algae buried in ocean sediments and ultimately heated and pressurized and often moved around into different geological deposits, but ultimately they're the remnants of organic matter from photosynthesis millions or even hundreds of millions of years ago. The exchange between these fossil reservoirs and the rest of the active carbon cycle, the terrestrial biosphere, the soils, the surface ocean, is obviously normally on a very long time scale. Occasionally you might get an oil or gas seep, or you might have the heating up of an oil and gas deposit geologically very slowly and the release of carbon dioxide. But that happens very, very slowly on geologic timescales. What we've done in the Industrial Revolution is take these fossil deposits, this photosynthetic energy that's been trapped in the earth for, in many cases, hundreds of millions of years, and we've combusted it, liberating it, putting it in the atmosphere very, very quickly. So, current emissions are getting very close to about 10 billion tons of carbon per year. So how does that extra carbon that we're putting in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuel actually interact with this complicated carbon cycle that's exchanging with all these different reservoirs? Well, the core bit of information we have really started with the observation of the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this was started by a man named Charles David Keeling, or Dave Keeling, as he was known to his friends. Dave Keeling started measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide in 1957, when it was about 315 parts per million. He did this at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, at the top of a volcano in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The reason he chose that site was he wanted to get as far away as he could from combustion of fossil fuels, from automobiles, from industry. And so on the top of a volcano in the middle of the Pacific, he thought he could get as much fresh air as possible. He continued to measure it. He was sort of a bulldog, and he kept at it over many years. He died in 2005 when CO2 was right around 380 parts per million. And his legacy is this extraordinary graph of the rising carbon dioxide, which his son Ralph Keeling continues to measure to this day. Just this year in 2014, carbon dioxide on a monthly average basis will pass for the first time 400 parts per million. One of the things Dave Keeling saw right from the beginning when he started measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide is that it has a big seasonal cycle of about 6 or 7 parts per million. Now, it started at about 315 parts per million, but he noticed that values went up in the wintertime and went down in the summertime. This is quite expected in the northern hemisphere. We know that in the spring and summer, deciduous plants take on leaves. As temperatures warm up, photosynthesis gets going and everything grows. And there's a huge amount of carbon that's taken up in the terrestrial biosphere. And so the atmospheric composition drops a few ppm. Then in the fall and the winter, a lot of trees drop their leaves, plants wither and die, and the bacteria in the soils and fungi respire that organic carbon and turn it back into carbon dioxide, and the flux from the soils is much greater than the uptake of carbon into the terrestrial biosphere. So we see this very strong seasonal cycle. There's also a fair amount of interannual variability. But the largest thing you see when you look at the Keeling curve is this steady rise from 315 parts per million in the late 50s up to 400 parts per million today. Now, what's interesting about this is that the amount of carbon dioxide required to explain this is actually relatively small compared to the total amount of fossil fuel burning that we have. The rise in carbon dioxide can be explained by only about 55 or 60% of the CO2 produced from fossil fuel burning. So where does that other carbon dioxide go? And what about the effects of deforestation and all of the other impacts on land that affect the carbon cycle? We think those add additional carbon dioxide emissions that we don't see in the atmosphere. So where is all this other carbon going? For a long time, this was a bit of a mystery. In fact, oceanographers and terrestrial ecologists used to argue about this. The oceanographers were pretty sure that the carbon wasn't going into the ocean, and the terrestrial ecologists were pretty sure that the carbon wasn't going into the land. It turned out the terrestrial ecologists were wrong, and the person who really figured this out was actually Dave Keeling's son, Ralph Keeling. So Ralph Keeling decided to do something really difficult. His father, of course, was famous for measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide, and Ralph decided to measure atmospheric oxygen. Now, you would think oxygen, boy, it's 20% of the atmospheric composition, it shouldn't be that hard. But what Ralph was trying to do was measure it very, very precisely. Because remember, as we burn fossil fuel, we're releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, but we're using up a fair amount of oxygen. So remember, Ralph's father, Dave, was measuring part per million changes in carbon dioxide, going from 315 to 400 parts per million, and seeing seasonal variations of several parts per million. What Ralph was trying to do was measure a few parts per million change in atmospheric oxygen, but that's a few parts per million out of 20%. 20% is like 200,000 parts per million. So it's a much, much smaller variation and a much more difficult measurement. And that's why it took Ralph basically 9 years to finish his PhD here at Harvard. But he ultimately did finish it, and he produced what I think of as one of the most extraordinary and most elegant records in the history of Earth science. If you look at his record, he's measuring atmospheric oxygen relative to nitrogen, which for all intents and purposes is constant in the atmosphere. And what you see here is atmospheric oxygen dropping each year with a seasonal cycle, just like you see in the carbon dioxide. You can think of it as almost the inverse of carbon dioxide. So why is it so special? Why was it so powerful to observe this drop in oxygen? First of all, just to be very clear, the drop in oxygen, some people ask, well, does that mean we're going to run out of oxygen to breathe? And the answer is, of course, not at all. We're talking about a drop of 100 parts per million or so in atmospheric oxygen out of 20% or 200,000 parts per million. So nobody should worry about not being able to breathe anytime soon. But what Ralph realized was that this could be an incredibly powerful tracer for understanding the carbon cycle. And the way he explained it was this very simple diagram. What he plotted on the x-axis was his father's variable, carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And on the y-axis, he plotted the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere, or the oxygen-nitrogen ratio. So if you start in 1990, as the first year when Ralph started making measurements, and then follow the data for the next 10 years, Ralph observed a drop in oxygen, just as you would expect, as carbon dioxide rises. And if you plot it on this graph of carbon dioxide versus oxygen, you see the oxygen fall just as the carbon dioxide goes up. What you can also plot is what you would expect to happen if 100% of the carbon dioxide used from fossil fuel burning were to go into the atmosphere. Now, it turns out that we have pretty good information globally about how much coal and oil and gas have been used. So if you took all the coal and all the oil and all the gas and burned it all over that 10-year period and put it all, 100% of that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you would expect carbon dioxide to go in 1990 from a little bit above 350 parts per million to a little bit above 380 parts per million in 2000. And oxygen, you would expect, would drop by about 45 parts per million. What you actually observe is that, in fact, carbon dioxide went up by only a fraction of that, and that oxygen also didn't drop by nearly as much. What explains the difference? And this is where Ralph Keeling's insights really were, I think, just brilliant. You can explain that difference based on two factors. One, ocean uptake, and the second, terrestrial uptake. Now, terrestrial uptake, we know, is done through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes up carbon dioxide and releases oxygen on a one-to-one basis. So for every part per million of decline in carbon dioxide, we would expect a 1 ppm rise in oxygen. On the other hand, ocean uptake of carbon dioxide doesn't really affect atmospheric oxygen. They have very different chemical solubilities, and so the uptake of carbon dioxide really is mostly independent of atmospheric oxygen. And so we would expect a horizontal line on this graph where it would only affect carbon dioxide but not oxygen. And so by drawing this simple diagram, we can actually explain this difference between what's observed and what we would predict for 100% release of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels based on these two simple vectors. One that is the ocean uptake is along the horizontal axis, and the second, which is on a one-to-one slope, that is done by terrestrial photosynthesis. And the magnitude of those was surprisingly similar. So the conclusion from Ralph Keeling's oxygen measurements is that, in fact, roughly half of the carbon dioxide that is missing, that is not appearing in the atmosphere, is being taken up by the ocean, which was about the number that oceanographers thought, and the other half is actually taken up by the terrestrial biosphere. When he first came out with this information, this was actually a big surprise to the terrestrial ecologists. Their estimates were that deforestation in tropical rainforests was so significant that it actually was, on average, releasing carbon to the atmosphere overall, so that the net terrestrial biosphere was releasing CO2 and was a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. What Ralph's oxygen measurements show is that, in fact, it's just the opposite, that despite that terrestrial deforestation, in fact, on average, the terrestrial biosphere is continuing to take up carbon, and that it's a net sink for carbon dioxide. Exactly where that sink is a bit of an argument. Some people think it's in the northern hemisphere forests, driven by CO2 fertilization, and that's probably an important part of the answer. It may be that overall the fertilization of plants by carbon dioxide is more important than some people thought, but this remains an important field of inquiry.